Yo, folks. So welcome. This is our final IGOV talk of the semester, and I want to remind you too that we'll continue on in the new year. So with Leanne Simpson on January 9th at 2 p.m. right here. But we are honored today to have Shalene Jobin speaking to us, and Shalene from Red Pheasant Cree and a former IGOVer. So she graduated in 2005, and it's been great to see Shalene interact with our new cohort and some of the other folks that have come in today for our Moose Fest. Shalene reminded me that I was also, she had nicknamed me BB, which is Bubble Burster. So now students have different names for me now. Soul Crusher, that sort of thing. Anyway, I'm really honored to have Shalene here. Her project her MA project was on Bent Arrow, an urban indigenous organization, and kind of redefining the governance of that program. And I remember going to her defense, and she defended kind of the pictorial representation of Bent Arrow on a buffalo hide, right, in her community. And so I told Shalene that her governance project is now required reading for current IGOV students. So it's been a real honor to work with Shalene over the years. Shalene is now a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta. She's also assistant professor and director of Aboriginal Governance, University of Alberta. So without further ado, I'll give you Shalene.
Danse, Shalene Jobin Nitsigasun, Loretta Watani Nigawi Nehiao Otsi Pihugamikos Tepaskanik, Fred Jobin Notawi, Wia Kia Apitogasen, Otsi Mitsi Maskoteo. Hello, my name is Shalene Jobin. I'm a Cree learner, and I was just giving an introduction of my family in Cree, and I said my mother were Watanies and from Red Pheasant Cree First Nation in Saskatchewan, and my father was Métis from northern Alberta, a place called Big Prairie, which is outside of High Prairie. I live at a place called Big Lake, which is west of Edmonton. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wasanich and Lukwigan people and the territory that this university resides on, and I just feel really honored to be here. I kind of feel like a little grasshopper in a land of giants, and just to be invited at this stage and what I'm doing is a real honor. I remember when I started IGOV, I think Ty and Jeff were maybe a little bit worried about me and seemed a little bit and was very naive. And there was this joke that at the end of IGOV, I'd have a whiskey bottle in one hand and cigars on the other, just really jaded. And I don't like whiskey, but I do like the odd cigar. So IGOV did definitely had an impact on my life. So I'd like to start with a story. And this story is about can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, this story is about my grandmother's, from my grandmother, Lilian Watney, and there's a little blue circle around her. I'm in the second row, all shy with my head turned. My grandmother, Lilian, was born in 1914 in Red Pheasant Cree First Nation. And even though all of my four grandparents, so my mother's parents and my father's parents, were forced to attend residential school, my grandmother Lilian is the only one that I ever got to discuss this experience with. She passed away in 2002. At around the age of 7, she was sent to a church-run residential school. And it was interesting because although there was a residential school outside of the reserve, she was sent to one in Manitoba. So there's a whole bunch of things that were implicated in that, and including her ability to come home often or at all. So before my grandmother passed away, in 1993, my grandmother asked my mom to take down some stories, and my mom's a writer, and the hope was that eventually my mom would publish these stories. And most of the stories my grandmother told weren't about residential school, but about learnings that she had as a child. So these are my grandmother's own words. She says, "My father's mother, Marie, first taught me to set snares. She was the younger of two sisters that my grandfather had for wives before he died in 1904. When the missionaries came to the reserve, he was told he could only keep one wife, and so Marie moved into a separate house. It was behind my parents' home, but when it caught fire and burned down, she moved in with us. I used to follow behind her as she gathered medicines and listen as she told me what they were used for. I was very young and can only recall her saying, "Ayota soma," this is frog pants, and this is good medicine. She would wrap the different medicines in a little calico cloth, and just by smell alone, she could tell the names of the different roots and herbs. She also used to dig for Seneca roots, which she would tell me she was going to sell to the Chinese people. Having been taught to taste the leaves and barks on the bushes of the berries we picked, I could tell you blindfolded a chokecherry from a raspberry or a Saskatoon bush. So my grandmother chose to record these words in this account for her descendants. She understood the importance of natural medicines and the knowledge her grandmother carried as a Cree woman. This story also explores how her grandmother taught her to hunt and trap. This is important to me, as often the important roles Indigenous women play in hunting and hunting-related activities are ignored in a lot of the literature, relegating these activities to the male sphere. Her hunting story speaks to a different lived experience, one that is not seen outside her worldview as abnormal. Lilian shared a few other stories. She says, "I was alone for 5 years before my sister Maria came along. I used to entertain myself by snaring rabbits. When I got a little older, I would also set traps on the lakes for muskrats and then wade in the water to retrieve my catch. One time, I was setting a trap and I forgot to set it off before slinging over my back. It caught me right on the bum. I screamed, cried, and jumped around until my grandmother heard the commotion. 'What's the matter, Nosum?' she asked. 'I'm caught, I'm trapped, it's got my bum,' I howled." This caused quite a few laughs to the people on the reserve for years to come. My grandmother says, "I was quite the little hunter. I also trapped a weasel. It was yellow-brown, for it was during the summer. I couldn't have been too old, for it looked ferocious to me, and I didn't dare go too close in case it scratched me. So instead, I decided to get my father. 'There's something in my trap,' I said to him. 'I don't know what it is, but it is a wicked animal.' My father tried to keep a stern face and agreed to go with me to see it. When he got to the trap, he held the weasel with a stick while stepping on the trap with his foot to release it. The weasel's fur was useless to us in summer, for to be paid anything, the fur had to be white. I would hunt for everything, even gophers, and I helped to clear my uncle's fields of them." So my grandmother also talked about the need to release animals if you weren't going to use them. And one of the things when I found these stories that I thought was really important is that the way she wanted to convey knowledge to us, her grandchildren, and to other people was one different than the one enforced in residential school. Lilian's words bring to the forefront a different type of teaching and learning. These teachings stem from her Cree knowledge, her connection to the land, and her identity as a woman. Despite the forced assimilation attempts, my grandmother hung on to her familiar teachings and also passed them on to another generation. My grandmother's stories weave 5 generations of Wet'ney women together, passing down her grandmother's knowledge to me. And it was really interesting to me because when I was looking over these accounts that she gave over the last 3 months, I realized that my grandmother's grandmother was named Marie. And my grandmother, her name's Lilian Marie, and my middle name is Marie. So it was just really meaningful to me that I carry on this name that's been passed down generation to generation. And I just realized that while reading these stories. Lilian's oral history speaks to an active resistance towards assimilation and the importance of passing down her knowledge to us to reclaim Cree teachings. This story conveys the importance of hunting to my grandmother and how this practice was cultivated in her from a young age. These words also speak to the importance of humor and learning about humility. These stories also speak to me about hunting for food and trade was and is an important part of Indigenous economies. So stories, there are different types of stories within Indigenous perspectives. Elder Jerry Saddleback, he's from Alberta, and Cree, categorizes 3 different types of stories. He says there's sacred stories, Indigenous legends, and personal stories. Lilian's accounts are examples of personal stories. Songhees scholar Robina Thomas, who I had a chance to chat with a little bit earlier, shares how important this connection is to her. She says, "My grandmother's stories are the essential core of my being. The stories are cultural, traditional, educational, spiritual, and political." Neil MacLeod, a Cree scholar, coins the term collective memory as the retelling of old stories that link grandparents with grandchildren. Lilian explains the teachings she received from her grandmother and recounting them as a way to pass on these teachings to her grandchildren, as well as linking us to our great-great-grandmother. Robina Thomas explains how storytelling, she says, also taught us about resistance to colonialism. Our people have resisted even when legislation attempted to assimilate our children. All stories have something to teach us, she says. What is most important is to learn to listen, not simply hear the words the storytellers have to tell. Many stories from First Nations, she says, tell a counter story to that of the documented history of First Nations in Canada. The writing of oral stories points to its living nature. Julie Cruikshank gives the example that these histories cannot be relegated to what she calls a freeze-dried past. Cruikshank believes that stories stay alive through the specific nuances and wisdom imparted by storytellers. Cree narrative memory is another concept developed by Neil MacLeod, and that's based on storytelling described as sustained through relationships, respect, and responsibility, enabling us to rethink the world around us and the limitations imposed by colonialism. Oral history should be seen as a social activity, many say, and that these stories gives us tools to live well. So my current research interest and kind of what I'm working on in my dissertation is looking at the ways that Plains Cree people engage in alternative economic relations. Specifically, I'm exploring how historical Indigenous economic relations can help us to understand current alternative economies and how these historic economic principles are being translated today. So, as I said, my focus is on Plains Cree people, and part of my methodology is using Cree stories to understand historic Cree economic principles. The next section of my presentations explores what I mean by alternative economic relations and why I think these alternatives are important. I then explore historic Cree economic relationships and some of the principles that emerge from the stories. And I end by sharing some of my preliminary thoughts on how this can impact us today. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of many others in IGOV that are doing similar work, and Cliff Atleo, who's also doing his PhD, he's doing a lot of really important work on this territory, looking at alternative economies. And some of his thoughts have informed, kind of challenged me in how I think of through some of these things. So this next section is called Market Citizenship and Indigeneity. So looking through the literature, I see that there's a current gap in a lot of mainstream literature, as well as a deficiency of energy spent in many Indigenous communities on the implications for negotiating for state-defined institutions of governance and the movement towards neoliberal economies. So I'm exploring Indigenous notions of identity through citizenship and the extent to which these understandings are being conditioned now by market liberalism. I ask, is the approach Indigenous peoples are taking, pursuing self-government through economic autonomy to lessen state controls, leading them to be increasingly subjugated to constitutive, hegemonic, and individualizing forms of being, therefore challenging notions of communal Indigenous identity in relations to the land? When looking through this, with the federal recognition of the inherent right to self-government for Aboriginal peoples within the jurisdiction of the Canadian state and the Canadian Constitution, many Aboriginal peoples are pursuing state-defined access self-determination, including striving for economic self-sufficiency. A common argument that I hear is that Aboriginal peoples need to be economically autonomous from the state to have true self-determination. Historically, colonial governing systems and currently neo-colonial forces have attempted and are currently attempting to reconstitute indigeneity, altering social relations, governing practices, and economic patterns. So I'm asking, how are Indigenous notions of identity and citizenship challenged within market governance? Indigenous identities are continually struggling against colonial and neo-colonial forces that seek to reconstitute them into peoples of their own imaginings and for their own benefit. So colonial domination of Indigenous peoples and settler societies have taken a two-pronged approach: state domination, bureaucratic control, and economic exploitation, resource extraction, development programs, etc. And I see oftentimes we just focus on the first part, the bureaucratic control. And if we only focus on the state domination aspect of settler society, we miss how attempts to resist this may actually further entrench the second colonial logic, that of economic exploitation. So I examine ideas of citizenship and identity through analysis of Cree people's conceptions of citizenship and comparing this with market notions of citizenship. So in an Indigenous way of thinking or in Indigenous languages, there isn't necessarily direct translations of citizenship, but and the way you conceive of it. So not necessarily related to rights and responsibilities to a nation state, but more of a way of being in the world. So in Cree, it's called Acimostakewin, the act of living well. Another one is a word that I think helps me think through this is Neoliberalism, which means good relationships. So how do we have good relationships with other beings? I once asked a Cree elder the meaning of self-determination, and this was actually an assignment in one of Jeff's classes, and Angela remembers that. And he told me it's nehiao-aski. And the term nehiao means a Cree person. The root of the word is nehio, which is the number 4. The suffix aski is the Cree word for land. Therefore, he said that nehiao-aski are the 4-spirited people of the land. That means that we have responsibilities and reciprocal relationships with the air, water, earth, and other living creatures. So through one reading of a Cree ontology, citizenship entails specific roles and responsibilities to other living beings. In this Indigenous view of citizenship, there is a reciprocal relationship between economic interactions, so relations to land, and modes of subjectivity, relations with land. How we relate to the land impacts who we are and the types of rights and responsibilities we can lay claim to. In contrast, a liberal economic model can falsely accept that to fundamentally alter relationship to the land will not significantly alter who we are. A notion of Indigenous citizenship is not simply a negative right, but also includes responsibilities to the earth itself. So when I'm looking at this idea of market citizenship, especially during this era of self-government, I see that Indigenous peoples striving for self-determination within the Canadian state is that we're being pushed into a foreign version of citizenship based on the values of the market. So that this push, equating self-determination to self-government, has constructed the movement along what I say is a neoliberal trajectory, directly impacting communal ideologies and relationships with the land. Isabel Ultramano Jimenez states that government practices regarding Indigenous demands are based on neoliberalism, which disconnects self-government from Indigenous territory. Indigenous scholars Maria Barr, she's Maori from Aotearoa, and Rona Kukanen have equated neoliberalism as the new form of colonization affecting Indigenous peoples. The marketization of Indigenous citizenship, they say, is the fulfillment of Indigenous demands through market integration and the rhetoric of cultural recognition. So neoliberalism can be seen as both a policy paradigm and as a practice. It's been explored extensively as a set of policies, as an ideology, and through the form of governmentality. And it moves this notion of business practices and the bottom line and capitalism, not just in the sphere of the business sphere, but into all areas of social life. So the three basic tenets of neoliberalism are free trade, the free mobility of capital, and a reduction in the role of the state. As an ideology, neoliberalism is the belief that sustained economic growth is the means to achieve human progress, and that human well-being can be best advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills. So neoliberalism goes beyond even just the state and looks at other institutions, organizations, and processes. Citizenship through this lens is often connected with Indigenous communities entering the market through a resource development extraction model of development. This type of citizenship model is challenging Indigenous identity and connections to the land, creating an environment where Indigenous rights are settled through state negotiations, and then land is therefore free to be exploited by market interests. So, what are alternatives for Indigenous peoples? Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard, another IGOV grad, writes that authentic freedom for a colonized people can only occur through what he says is transformative praxis, where colonial identities are shed. And he says, without the process of desubjectification, Indigenous peoples will be limited to colonial forms of liberty and justice, internalizing them as their own. Coulthard suggests a critical, self-affirmative, and self-transformative process of desubjectification, where Indigenous societies' gaze is directed away from the state recognition and to on-the-ground practices of freedom. I remember in some of my IGOV classes, Daige Alfred would talk about this politics of distraction and how if we focus on the state and focus there for recognition, then that distracts us for these on-the-ground practices. So I'm interested in exploring alternatives to neoliberal economies for Indigenous peoples, specifically exploring the Plains Cree. And I've been figuring out how to do this. And one of the ways is I am looking at right now is looking at historic Cree economic principles and practices and seeing how they may or may not be applied today. And one method I've been using is through Cree stories. And the next section will delve into this a bit more. So as I talked at the start, one area of Indigenous studies is the importance of oral stories. And Indigenous oral traditions have an important place to play within the discipline, and a place to play where Indigenous ontologies, ways of seeing the world, are celebrated. Oral histories are linked to self-determination of Indigenous peoples, as it is a way to retain and reclaim culture. And it's also used as a way to fight for different rights, Indigenous rights. The concepts of oral tradition, oral history, and storytelling can remain confusing, as they are often given different definitions in the literature, and sometimes used interchangeably. Whereas oral tradition usually applies to knowledge relating to ontology and epistemology, oral history is seen as a research method and a methodology. The literature on Indigenous studies research discusses the power embedded within stories, which enable communities, this is Linda Twai Smith who says this, to give testimonio to their collective her stories and struggles. Inherent in stories are the ontological teachings and empowering motivators that link to transformative praxis. Chamberlain and Val equate the work of scholars to storytelling. They say, we scholars tell old stories, and we make up new ones. We call the first teaching and the second research. But whatever we call them, it puts us in an ancient tradition of elders, experts, and eccentrics, telling tales and singing songs. So I see storytelling as a useful pedagogical and methodological device in Indigenous studies research. So Thomas King famously writes, and I think he was here recently, the truth about stories is it's all we are. As Indigenous peoples often come from oral societies, storytelling is proposed as an honoring of Indigenous ontologies, ways of being in the world and seeing the world, and as a useful decolonization technique, which presents a counter-history to Canada's well-documented story. Beyond providing a counter-history, storytelling can be used as a medium to communicate rights and jurisdictional boundaries that have political impacts. So what my process was, part of my methodology of exploring stories was inspired by Val Napoleon and Hadley Friedland and how they engage with stories related to Indigenous legal traditions. And then I kind of looked at that process and saw that it was an interesting way to think through things and started thinking about, well, could that be adapted to look at Cree economies? Over the last 3 months, I've read over 160 Cree stories. Some of these stories would be characterized as sacred stories, legends, creation stories, historical accounts, and some, like my grandmother's, are personal stories. Of these 160 initial stories, I found 25 related to Cree economic relationships. So these stories I coded using terms from the text relating to economic relationships. I did this using en vivo software, which might not seem really indigenous, but I think when the gun was introduced, people started still using it. So, for us, we used to have a Tim, which is the dog, but when Mr. Tim came, the big dog or horse, it's not like we said, oh no, let's not use it. So I'm trying this. So I used en vivo software, giving different categories to the different elements. Examples of a few of the categories that were based on the actual wording of the text are trading with non-humans, harvesting herbs, trade communication, and gift giving. So I found 42 different categories, which were then assembled into 8 broader categories. Some commonalities and themes have started to emerge, and I'm going to keep doing this, but this is how much I've gotten so far in time for this presentation, so I'll go home and continue to read through this. So what I'm going to present are some of the themes that have started to emerge, and I've also supplemented that with some archival research that I've done. The first theme that emerged from the stories is ecological management, community-minded governance, and relations with the land. One of the things that is apparent from the stories is the importance of ecological management, principles around not overusing resources, and the importance of only taking as much as needed. This element was found in each type of the story that I looked at: sacred, legend, and personal. So one legend I read, this is a quote from it, says, "The summer was very dry and growth was slow, so there were only a few berry patches, and the berries themselves were small. In seasons such as these, it was customary for a camp to go together to pick all the berries they could, so that everyone would have an equal chance to get some food for the family." So there's also a personal story in one of the accounts, and it says, and this fellow had Indigenous heritage, but he hadn't grown up in his community. And he says, "My wife had once said that since we were going to make a living hunting buffalo, she did not want me to kill more than we could dry and pack. She told me that if I brought in an extra hide without the carcass, she would not dress it." So the wife was teaching him the proper protocol and how hunting buffalo. So coming out of the stories, there is also this concept of unacceptable practices and implications for that. And one was what happened when people were greedy. So this is part of a Cree legend. It says, "When the fruit was plentiful, Indians picked them without any set rules. On the other hand, when lean years caused a scarcity, scouts were sent out to search for berry patches. When they located some, the camp was informed, whereupon rules were enforced, including the provision that no one was to go out until the whole camp was prepared to go on a berry picking expedition." And then the story goes on, and it says, "But there were always some greedy and grasping individuals who only thought of themselves. Early one morning, a couple left the village before sunrise, planning to quietly come back with their berries while everyone was still sleeping. They thought that no one would ever know. They then took along their birch bark baskets and were picking at the berry patch when suddenly they heard a loud crash of breaking brush, indicating that something was approaching them. 'Musqua! Musqua! A bear! A bear!' cried the man. They became so frightened that they dropped their containers, berries and all. The bear was close on their heels by this time, growling and snorting fiercely. They were so terrified that they ran as fast as they could, finally reaching the camp. The noise had aroused everyone, and the people just stood outside their teepees and looked at them. The couple was so humiliated and ashamed that they disappeared into their teepee and didn't show themselves for several days. It is said, anytime anyone tried to get ahead of the others in picking berries, they were sure that they could hear the growls and grunts of the bears, reminding them that they must think of others." So this story is a teaching reminder of the importance of thinking of the society, the collective. Another aspect of community-minded governance has to do with sharing. Here is a part of a personal story from a text. It says, "The men who had horses chased the buffalo for the others, and everyone got some of the meat, which would be hauled into the camp by the dogs. There was no selfishness. It is an Indian custom to share with others. That has always been so. The strong take care of the poor. There is usually enough for all." And then I thought it was really interesting. Fine Day tells this account of being inducted into the Warrior Society for the Cree. And this is a story that he tells. He says, "Then an old man said to those of us who had just been taken as warriors, 'From now on, your homes and your possessions are not your own. From today, these two old men, the servers, are the owners of your goods. If a poor person comes for help and you are not at home, these men may give away your things. You must look after all the people. If their moccasins are torn, you must supply new ones. Any clothing you may have must be given to those who come for help and who need it. If you see an old person stranded while camp is being moved, you must get off your horse and put him on. Then the horse is his.'" So I thought it was really compelling that this notion of sharing and was tied into a warrior philosophy, and that this was a really high standard that warriors had to live by. Today I took part in Moose Fest, and I was really heartened to see this notion of sharing and the importance of community mindfulness being at play, and even the stories of how the moose came to be here. And I also, my time at IGOV, I know we did a lot of collective activities, which was really an important part of the learning process. And one that came to mind when I was writing this was, and this was just an aside thing, one of the students that were in our class, there was a house fire, and it was just really amazing for me to see IGOV people come around her and share the things that she needed to get her through that time. And I just thought that was kind of a practical, current example of kind of these teachings that are coming through these stories. So another theme that emerges from the Cree stories is the importance of gifting. Gift giving was part of the protocol before trading occurred, before diplomatic functions like Indigenous treaties were made, and as a dispute resolution mechanism, and in many other processes, including in ceremony. Gifting is still a widespread practice among the Cree. And there was an accepted protocol of gift giving followed amongst the Plains people before trade commenced. The type of protocol or ceremony around trade depended on the material being traded. For example, when the buffalo dance was bought from the Dakota, the pipestream carrier led the Cree to the warriors' lodge of the Dakota. The Cree piled clothes in front of the lodge and tied the horses they were giving onto the teepee stakes. The Dakota then came out and gifted the Cree with clothes, so to buy back their ability to still perform the buffalo dance. After the transfer was completed, the Dakota invited the Cree into their lodge to teach them the songs and dance. Some Cree people state that many Cree medicines originally came from the Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe. There is a man called Muskwa, which means bear in Cree, and he explains of a Plains Cree who traveled to the east to receive medicines. He presented 2 horses loaded with well-made clothes. In exchange, the Anishinaabe took them into their Medewin lodge. They taught him about many plants to be used for medicinal purposes. It is said that a chief had to freely give of his possessions and usually set the pace for ceremonial giving. So when thinking about gift giving in Plains Cree culture, one of the things that was really apparent just in growing up and the things we took part of, as well as in the stories, was the giveaway ceremony, or the giveaway dance. And I think this really encapsulates the importance of gift giving for the Cree. And it's interesting, but this ceremony is associated with having a successful hunt. It's also still really popular in Cree country, and the legend of the giveaway ceremony is recounted from Mike from Saddle Lake Cree Nation, and there's a few different stories that talk about the giveaway dance, and this was a different story, illustration from a different version. It says, during a very harsh winter, a camp found themselves unable to find any sources of food. All men took turns going out to hunt, but were not successful. The situation in the camp was getting very serious, and without food, all the members would starve. Finally, as a last resort, one of the hunters decided he would venture out on his own. When the hunter had been out in the woods for many days and unable to find any animals, he spent an evening just sitting by the fire and thinking of his dilemma, when he noticed a little skinny man just outside of the circle. He tried to befriend this little skinny man, but was unable to. During the night, when the skinny man thought the hunter was asleep, he crept up to him. Very quickly, when the skinny man was asleep, the man captured the skinny man. This skinny man is really fearful of anything that a woman touched. The hunter had tied the skinny man up with women's leggings. The skinny man was helpless, so he began to beg and plead with the hunter to let him go. He promised the hunter a ceremony that would assist him in his hunt if he was freed. The hunter decided he would free the skinny man. In return, the skinny man taught him songs. He taught him to use the pipe. The hunter was taught all the procedures of this ceremony. He was told that if anyone is to practice it, that this is also life-giving. The hunters used the songs that they were given. This ceremony is where the hunter was given the life of an animal in order for his tribe to survive. In order to give thanks for the gifts that Cree people receive during the year, this is a ceremony where they bring gifts to share with other people attending the ceremony. So this is the history of the giveaway dance. And it is said that the giver would dance toward the person for whom the gift was intended, and no gift could be refused. The receiver was then to give a gift of equal value to someone else. And we also modified different things like, for example, when I did my master's project, Shauna Seneca was one of the executive directors, and the next year she passed away. So the community held a round dance and a giveaway ceremony every year for 4 years. And I know when some of our relatives passed away, like my father, we did the same thing. So it's definitely part of a lot of ceremonial aspects of our life. So this is one personal story from a text which recounts one happening of a giveaway dance. It says, "On the second night of the giveaway dance, we heard a knock on the parchment door of the house. It sounded like a drum. I asked who was there. My wife's uncle answered and asked my wife to get up at once. She did. We opened the door. Trache handed my wife 7 long shaganappies, which are long ropes of buffalo hide, and told her to dance. My wife said that she could not dance. Trache answered that if she did not dance, she would not get her present. I went to the parchment door and beat the time upon it. My wife danced. Trache and I sang. The translation is, I hope that we will live long. Then Trache told my wife to come and get her present. There were 7 horses at the ends of the 7 shaganappies, 5 buffalo robes, 2 bags of pemmican, and 2 pails of dried meat. Trache sang, this is a very fast horse that I'm giving you. And also, I'm giving you the reins now. I was so surprised that I didn't even know what to do with all these presents. The whole settlement had to take part in the dance, and each one was expected to contribute. So there are many aspects of this ceremony that can be discussed when related to Cree economies. One element is the redistribution of wealth within the society. Another element is the connection between this redistribution and success in a forthcoming hunting trip. And I haven't thought through this fully, but I know Hillary, Cliff, and I were talking about this a little bit yesterday. So in another text it says, this ceremony was banished by the Indian agents as they felt the Indians were too poor to lose their valuables. They failed to understand that the bearer of gifts within a giveaway ceremony or a giveaway dance always received another gift of the same value. It was a redistribution of goods, and it wasn't receiving a gift from the same person back. There was a redistribution within the society, and is. So for me, this is part of the cycle of Cree society and maintaining Cree economic relationships. The importance of trading is another element that emerges from within the stories, as well as from archival sources. So in reading, one of the stories that I came across was about Mamakweshiwak, and they were considered the little people. And there's little people stories throughout all of Turtle Island. So for the Cree, these were the stoneworkers making arrowheads, flint knives, and stone heads for hammers. And the interesting part is that it is said in this legend that they traded with the Cree people for buffalo meat, hides, porcupine quills, and other things they needed and couldn't obtain for themselves. And another interesting part was talking about trade communication, how there was only certain privileged individuals within Cree communities that were given the honor of trading with the little people, and that they would have to do this either during the night or early in the morning. And what they would do is they would take a stick and draw in the ground what they wanted traded. So when looking at trade, I talk about how it's international trade. So there's trade that happens within the Cree people, and there's also trade that happens with others. For the Cree, food, ornamental goods, livestock, raw goods, processed goods, medicines, and ceremonies were key commodities for import and export. So trading often revolves around exchanging goods of abundance for those desired. And before European settlement, buffalo, other game, fish, fowl, vegetal foods, and berries were found in abundance. Wild rice did not grow on the plains, but was harvested and traded by Indigenous peoples in the East. And we had some wild rice today, which was awesome. It is also recorded that the Cree made an annual journey to the southwest to obtain corn. Trade with those living by salt water would have provided mussel shells used for utensils and earrings. So a trade relationship also occurred where agricultural producers living in what is now southern Ontario and the St. Lawrence Valley supplied corn and other products to those living without the same agricultural base, exchanging them for fish or furs. This is a picture by an artist, the late Dr. Dale Auger, and a Cree guy. And I love this picture because it's aesthetically pleasing, but also because of what it represents. So this is what Dr. Dale Auger talks about. He says, a warrior had crossed over the mountains to the big water, loaded with his cargo of buffalo pemmican, to trade for dried salmon. The prize of the trade of Plains people was the brightly colored shells worn as ceremonial earrings and necklaces. So I just thought that was a beautiful picture to represent this international trade that was so abundant on Turtle Island. So archaeological evidence has shown a lot of items that have been traded on and found on Plains land. Bones and shells from the west coast have been found by the South Saskatchewan River. Native copper mined outside of Thunder Bay over 8,000 years ago and manufactured into different items are found across the plains. Shell gorget was recovered on the plains from a clamshell only available from the Gulf of Mexico. In Edmonton, a 1,000-year-old piece of pottery from the South Saskatchewan Basin was uncovered. And so it kind of points to this diverse market of goods, which were part of an extensive international trade network throughout Turtle Island. And this trail system, I think, is so interesting that these trails were around and were really widely used. The Old North Trail is one that's really, there's a lot written about it and a lot talked about. So Acimostakewin is that's the lake, and I live around that lake. It's called Big Lake. And then these are known encampments in the area that's now known as Edmonton. So the Old North Trail went from the Rossdale Flats, so the river, the North Saskatchewan River. It went from a Pohonan, so a Cree gathering place, all the way down. There's a whole trail system that went down part of the Rocky Mountain system. It went down where Highway 2 is today, so to get from Edmonton to Calgary, and went all the way down into Mexico. So there's evidence of this trail system being used. And it wasn't just one trail, it was a whole system of trails. The meeting place, the Pohonan, and there was many Pohonans. Pohonan in the Cree language means a gathering place. There's one in the Rossdale Flats area, and the evidence shows that this was a meeting place, especially for Cree, Chippewa, Beaver, Nakota, and Blackfoot, and there was also a lot of trading that would happen at this Pohonan. An article written in the Edmonton Bulletin in 1880 said that Edmonton was an ancient trade center, a strategic location where mutually unfriendly nations found it convenient to trade. And I found this oral account that was given by a fellow named Bringsdown the Sun, and he was a Piikani spiritual leader, and he shared this with Walter McClintock in 1905. And he says, there's a well-known trail we call the Old North Trail. It runs north and south along the Rocky Mountains. No one knows how long it's been used by the Indians. So then he goes on to explain of this trip that happened, and he says who was on the trip were Elk Tongue and his wife Natoya, Arrowtop, and Pemmican. So Pemmican at the time of this trip was 12, and in 1905 when this account was taken down, Pemmican had just died a few years ago. So there's there's a lot, it was really, it hadn't happened that far in the past. And so of this trip, these people, they went down all the way down into Mexico by this trail system, and they came back 18 months later. So it took them 12 months to go down and 18 months to come back. And they say that Elk Tongue, who led the trip, brought back the dancing pipe from the area now known as Mexico. So that's just one example of these trail systems being used. And it said that they took 18 months to get back because they went back by the Bitterroot country where they could travel without danger of being seen. So at certain points in time in history, a lot of warring happened on the Old North Trail. So this informative account provides insights into the age of the Old North Trail, the uses of the trail, the length of travel time, and ceremonial trade with Indigenous peoples. So it's also documented that fur traders used these Indigenous trail system, and later settlers used these same trails. And many of our current highways and railways are using these same transportation networks. So one example would be Highway 2 in Alberta. And the research that I'm looking at alternative Cree economies, I'm looking at kind of this Pohonan space here up to Big Lake, and then looking at if you went west more, it would be Lac St. Anne, and then a little bit south would be Wabamun. So that's kind of the geographic area where when I'm going to continue to do my research looking at alternatives that are happening within that space. Another way that Plains Cree traveled were over these boats. So the Saskatchewan River for Plains people was a significant part of the east-west trail system. And it's not just Cree people, but this is just the example that I'm giving today. For water, travel boats were used. So this figure is Cree men on what's called a Cree flatboat on the Montreal River in Saskatchewan. So archaeological evidence has confirmed that boats have been used on the prairies for over 13,000 years. So this just is small examples of the extensive infrastructure that happened on these lands, and that there weren't just trail systems, but there are also all these international trade norms, practices, and protocol that were part of an international trade system and part of a diplomatic function of these different peoples. So another cool thing that I find is really interesting is also the extent that shows the extent of international trade is how there was these indigenous languages that were developed, and some were considered used for trade, but there is also it was a sign language that was developed for trade. So this is a sign for the word trade, and or actually this is the sign for the word exchange, and so it's two hands in front of each other, and it's like this. So there's hundreds and hundreds of these different signs that exist. And in 1930, in Browning, Montana, they had a gathering where they brought Indigenous peoples from different societies together that had never met before, and they told stories, and these were recorded using this sign language. So that just kind of points to the extent that this international trading happened. So there's trading words for trade, barter, buy, exchange. Flashing mirrors was another, in the sun was another method to communicate over a distance. So I guess this section, I just wanted to talk about the plethora of goods, complex trading infrastructure, and protocols that point to this extensive trade network. So where do we go from here? I guess my question now, looking at this, and I'm going to continue to look at this, is what are ways of relating these economic principles today? And are there ways that this can be almost considered, we can do things that are almost considered acts of resistance in terms of Indigenous economies? And one thing that might sound funny, but I thought it was really intriguing, is last year I was looking on Kijiji, and there was a pair of mucklucks that were being sold, but not for money. What the fellow wanted was a double bed, because he needed a double bed. And so after talking to him some more and going to his house, and I found that he had a whole ton of different Cree, a Plains Cree guy, and he had a whole ton of different items that he didn't make. And what he said, he was a counselor in First Nations communities. so what I started to think through was that he was getting these items to pay for this counseling service that he was providing. So I thought, isn't that interesting that we're using this new technology using Kijiji, but to do this ancient process of trading, and how I think trading could be considered an act of resistance. One is that it restores Indigenous economic relationships. So I made this relationship with this person in these trading items. Another thing is it makes me think through the neoliberal capitalist system that we live in, and it would be really hard. I was thinking yesterday, could I go a month without being involved in the capitalist system? And you know, there's that food challenge where you eat I was thinking, I wonder if I could do that. But just practices like this, like trading with someone. For example, my niece is a hairdresser, so trading hairdressing for a haircut for something that you need restores some of these relationships that sometimes we miss out on. So that's one example. Another example of, so where I live now, I live by Big Lake, and this is actually Métis script land. And so the people's land that I live on is actually the Cunninghams all have script land historically, and they still all live in this area west of Edmonton. And down the road from the Cunninghams, maybe about a mile, is the Larondells. And so, so this is down the road from my house. And has anyone ever read Winona LaDuke's first book? Yeah? So in her first book, she talks about the importance of buffalo and the importance of buffalo on plains land and how that restores ecological relationships and the importance of just having it on the land for the ecosystem. And so Bill and Elsie Larondel, Métis people that live down the road from me, have decided it's important for them and their relationships and how they think about Mi'kmaq, good relationships and living well, to have these buffalo reintroduced. So now they have this herd of buffalo that they've reintroduced on their land. And so that for me is just another example of a really kind of active resistance of ways to reestablish these relationships, not only with people, but with animals. The other thing that I think is a really cool thing within the area I'm looking at is it's called Kichi Eski, which is Sacred Land Project. And it's in the heart of what's now Edmonton, in kind of a little bit south of one of the known Ponens Cree gathering places. And there's a huge trail system, like where people walk in Edmonton, and it's really forested. But it's called Fox Farms. And the city of Edmonton has given land to the Edmonton Indigenous Cultural Resource Council. And so they've given this land in the heart of the city, but it's all forested. And this council is now doing different Indigenous practices and kind of indigenizing this urban space. And one of the things they're doing is they're harvesting and growing traditional medicines, but in a cooperative fashion. And they're doing it in this space. So I think, isn't that cool that this is being done and these relationships are happening, as well as this ecological management of these traditional things that were grown in that space. Let's see what time I'm at. Okay, so 3 more minutes. So that's 3 kind of small examples of kind of what I'm looking at right now. And I'll just end with another story from my grandmother. So there's different stories that can be told. And for Cree people, one of the stories that we think are sacred stories are called Wasakechek stories. And there's different protocol on when we can tell these stories. So we're not supposed to historically be able to tell these stories in the summer. And there's different things that are said that could happen to you, like getting bitten by a lizard. So my grandmother talks about this Wasakechek story. And her grandmother, so her Nokum, shared these Wasakechek stories with her, and my grandma wanted to share them with us and wanted them written down. So my grandmother says, "My grandmother always wore black, a black skirt and blouse, moccasins, and a black handkerchief tied around her head. She spoke only Cree. She still had good eyesight, for I remember she could spot an insect from across the room. 'Nokum,' I'd tell her, 'you're so beautiful.' 'Gea sita nosim,' she'd answer. 'Long ago, granddaughter, I used to be a beautiful young woman.' 'You're still beautiful, grandmother,' I'd reply, or 'Nokum,' I'd reply to her, and then I'd ask her to tell me a story, which she would only do in the winter. for she said it was bad luck to tell them in the summer. Okay, she'd answer, but first sit here until I finish smoking. I would watch as she filled her little clay pipe with tobacco and stare as she took each puff, watching patiently for her to finish so that she could tell me a story. Finally, she'd begin. Wasakechak, the trickster, was walking in the woods when he heard some laughter. Being inquisitive by nature, he followed the sounds until he came across a flock of birds. "Why are you laughing, brothers?" he would say. "We have headaches," they answer, "and so we are throwing our eyeballs up into the trees." "What happens then?" Wasakechak asked his feathered friends. "We only have to shake the trees and then the eyeballs fall back into our heads and we cure our headaches," they answered. For everyone had to answer Wasakechak when he talked to them. "I have a headache too," Wasakechak said. "Oh, you must not say that just for the fun of it," the birds chirped, "or something bad will happen to you," they added. "I understand," Wasakechak said before adding, "but I do have a headache." The birds did not believe him and so said, "We're warning you, you must not do this for nothing." Wasakechak did not listen to the bird's advice. Instead, he threw his eyeballs up into the trees. Just then, a fox was walking by, and when Wasakechak shook the tree to get his eyeballs back, the fox caught them in his mouth and ran away. Wasakechak didn't really have a headache and now found himself without eyes. Being blind now, he stumbled to the different trees and touched their bark. "Brother," he asked, "what kind of tree are you?" Each of the trees he touched identified themselves and told Wasakechak what kind of medicinal powers their bark, leaves, and roots were good for. Finally, Wasakechak reached a spruce tree, and after feeling its bark, he asked, "What kind of tree are you, my brother?" "Meneik," the tree answered. "You are just the tree I need." Wasakechak cried with happiness. He climbed into its branches until he found its resin. He put it into his mouth and began to chew it until it finally became soft. From that, he rolled out the first one and put it in his eyeball, and then placed the other one into the other empty socket. He thanked the tree for giving him their medicine so that he could see once more. So this tree is layered in meaning. It speaks to proper and improper relations with other living things. It also speaks to Indigenous knowledge of the natural world and the medicines that are abundantly available. Lilian also explains the significance of one aspect of the Indigenous knowledge found within the story. So these are my grandmother's words. She said, "Now, it wasn't until I reached my 70s that I finally understood what the story was all about. It tells us that the gum of the spruce tree is medicine for the eyes because the tree produces a specific vitamin for the eyes. The old Indians knew this, so if someone had cataracts, they would take a feather and dip it into medicine before swathing the person's eyes. My grandmother never explained the curing part to me, for I was just a child. Instead, she told it to me like a story. The next night, I would say to her again, 'A Chimo no kam, tell me a story.' 'Chesgwa, wait a minute,' she'd answer, and she would go through the same ritual as smoking her pipe before beginning. So this story tells of medicines found on the land, as well as to relate to the animal world and nature. My grandmother explains the different layers of meaning within the story. As a child, she understood certain teachings within Wasakechak's stories. As she grew older and her knowledge increased, her levels of understanding became apparent. This is part of the magnificence of Indigenous stories and the wealth of knowledge included within. Iksimaga, thank you.
All right, we have some time for some questions. Comments?
I have a question. Where did she get the buffalo from?
The family? That's a good question. I don't know, but I do know that just west or east of Edmonton is Elk Park, and you'd think there'd be elk there, but there's mostly buffalo, and it's a natural park for buffalo. So I do know that sometimes when they have too many that you can buy them. Yeah, but I'm not sure if this is where they got their buffalo. I'll have to ask.
And ecosystems still look pretty similar, so they can like live there and sustain themselves.
Oh yeah, like this is the traditional territory of the buffalo. Yeah. A part of it. Hi.
interested, towards the end of your discussion, you expanded the territory a little bit in the sense of the area you're describing to include the urban centre of Edmonton and what's going on there. So as you move from the question of these stories and trying to understand the principles and the economic principles behind them, are you thinking of, and how this would now be implemented in a contemporary context?
Yeah.
Are you thinking of looking at the question of the relationship between Indigenous economic activities in urban centres and those which you might find in the land base, and how those two might connect to form an integrated Indigenous economy, if you will? Or are you just keeping your attention on the one land-based set of activities? Or how are you going to approach that question?
Yeah, good question. And I'm glad you asked it. Actually, so this picture, so where this gathering place, where a lot of those triangles are, that's a Pohonet, so a historic gathering place, and that's actually in the heart of Edmonton. So the research area I'm looking at starts there and then goes west to Wabamun Lake, Lac St. Anne. And so I'm not looking at it as this is reserve space, this is urban space. I'm just looking at it all as Indigenous space and what's happening in this Indigenous space. And as you can see, and I'm looking at a historical context and these things that are happening, but as you can see, this was an Indigenous space, and a lot of our cities were built on Indigenous spaces because that's where a lot of us gathered historically, and then the cities, the fur trade built up around where Indigenous people were, and then cities built up against it. So the answer is I'm not differentiating too much on, okay, this is an urban space. I'm just looking at Indigenous practices within the space I'm looking at, whether they're urban or rural. Hey.
I have a comment and a question. I just think this is not what I expected in a good way. I found your presentation just fascinating. I was wondering how you created this link for yourself, like how you decided to look at narratives as alternative economies in narratives. How did you create that link? That's never something I've thought of before. I just think.
Well, I guess, so I had been a part of a project that Napoleon was doing, going to Indigenous communities in northern BC and northern Alberta, and looking at stories from those places related to dispute resolution in Indigenous legal traditions. And so I'd gone on some of these trips and pulled out some of those teachings and how people from the community really related to these stories and thinking through those principles. And so then I've been interested in looking at alternatives to economies for a while, and I thought, well, why couldn't I look at the stories and see principles of economic principles that might be in the stories? So.
If you looked into, in economics, a conversation a year back, a year 8 months,
Yeah.
between different cultures, a lot of the activity, functional versus words, are linguistic differences as opposed to functional differences. So when one talks about alternatives to capitalism, if you look past functionality or the claim functionality, often you find that it's just a linguistic difference, that someone trading for a hide for berries or whatever, there still is, in the words you would use today, some kind of economic exchange between two families, two people. They come to an agreement of exchange. And they're only able to come to an agreement because they agree on the value of what they're giving and value of what they're receiving. However they value that value. And really, that's really just linguistics. You know, they just because the word capitalism wasn't used, or then, or we don't use the word trading as much now, doesn't change, see the function of actually occurred that went on, as opposed to the words. Because there still was a trade. And often when you introduce a third one, like you mentioned this man who was offering, or trying to trade something for a double bed.
A double bed for muffins.
Right. And often you see someone would trade something for, they need trade away something, but they got something that maybe are more of than they needed.
Yeah.
So they had a surplus. So then they're holding on to a surplus of something.
Yeah.
But then they trade that to somebody else for something else they need.
Yeah.
Well, then that surplus has a value.
Yeah.
It may change. It's not perishable, it's not perishable, you better trade it off pretty soon. So you still end up with people thinking economically where do we use today.
Yeah.
Let's say they're still thinking in terms of value or in a more functional, life-preserving sense. Right?
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah.
And in a more immediate sense than we would today, because it comes in, put it in a can, or you put it in the fridge, or kind of thing. So some of these things, I'm just going to point out, some of these things are linguistic, and it's not as functionally different than as it might appear, because people still had to survive, people still traded. As we know, and I mean, and to the very extent that you pointed out, these long trails.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't go on these 1 to 2 year treks, for a small matter.
Yeah.
I mean, that alone should point out a large importance of the value of whatever trading was going on was very valuable. Whatever words were used to express that, whatever words were used to express the value or uses.
Yeah. Yeah, so I definitely see what I explained today as part of Cree Economies, and I definitely see that being historically grounded in that and contemporarily. So I see it as part of the economy. And where my thinking is around that is that there's definitely a distinction for me and how I'm thinking through this between these economic practices and a neoliberal capitalist system that, for example, in Alberta that we live in heart of oil and gas country, that we're faced in. And so a lot of Indigenous peoples and communities, they're saying, yay, self-government, but to do self-government, we have to not be dependent on Indian affairs or Aboriginal affairs. So we have to get economic development, and that means opening up a casino, or it means oil and gas development. So when I might critique that, then someone says, okay, well, what else? And so part of this is a thought experiment of deconstructing what is it about neoliberal economies that is problematic. And there's a really helpful book called Spirit Gifting, and it's by a Métis elder in Alberta who's from the Métis settlement. So in Alberta, there's 8 Métis settlements, so actual land bases for Métis peoples historically, and they still live on them. And he lived in one of the settlements, and he said, he accounts for his switch from being a child and what he calls living with the land to the switch of going into, they had an oil and gas development on their settlement, to going to living off the land. So he had this mental shift that he says his community went through from living with the land to living off the land. And he said it caused a discomfort so great that he had to reconstruct his whole worldview and what it meant to be who he was. And so his whole book talks about that. And he says there's different manifestations of this disconnect of not living with the land. And some of it, he said, was alcoholism, some different things like that. And so I found that really instructive, that there seems to be this shift when we don't have these ecological relationships, that we don't have these other relationships, and our decisions are based just on the bottom line. And I don't know, before I did IGOV, I actually did my undergrad in business and in a really right-wing business school. So I come from this from a place of looking at it from the inside and then questioning some of it, and then looking at, okay, what are alternatives for us? It's one thing for me to deconstruct and critique it, but it's another thing for me to think, okay, what are ways that we can be in this world? And I mean, I don't know, like it could be considered hypocritical that like I still am involved in the capitalist system, but what are ways that I can maintain relationships that are acts of resistance even through this, and at least even have the self-reflexivity of understanding this system and some of the implications that it has on us as individuals and communities.
thanks for your great talk. Just to respond to what you were saying, I think it's an important distinction, it's a Marxian distinction between exchange value and use value, where what you're describing is very different to what the capitalist system is, where the sole object is the accumulation of capital. And I think what you're describing is fundamentally different to that. What's an interesting question as well is the distinction between gifting and exchange. I'm not sure how you would articulate that.
Yeah.
And I have another question.
And Rona Kukanen, who's an Indigenous scholar, she's actually Sami, she wrote her whole dissertation on gifting, and so she goes more into the nuances of the impacts and kind of how it's not a time thing that happens right in the moment, but can go on over years. Sorry, your other question?
The other question I had, I'm part digital humanist. It's my client in some ways. How you're dealing with tales. So it's really interesting thinking about the archive. There's a lot of work going on with digital humanities right now. And I'm sure you're at University of Alberta. I'm sure you're using in vivo. You've come into contact with some of that. The question of marking up and archiving these tales, how could we think about the problems of archiving and representation that still remain? And for instance, there's some, I've heard of some storytellers who refuse to be recorded.
For sure. Those are huge questions and very relevant and important questions. And to be honest, I haven't worked through it fully, but kind of some of the ways that I've thought through it to move forward, at least to now, is the stories that I've used and worked with are stories where the storyteller knew they were going to be published and knew they were going to be in book format and was okay recounting the stories to use it in that way. And even my grandmother, who shared her stories, she shared those stories to be ideally one day written and published. So one of the ways that I'm thinking through it is, okay, did the person who gave that information have full knowledge of the implications of putting stuff down in text? And for the ones I've used today, the answer for all of them was yes. But there's other sources too that I don't know if I would even feel okay doing. And even sharing my grandma's Wasaki Check story, I talked to elders about, is this an okay thing to do? And and then also being able to deconstruct some of that stuff and think through, where I live, there's no lizards. Do I think that a lizard is going to come and bite me, or should I just not do it because there's respect? Or kind of thinking through what perhaps were some of the reasons. Could it have been, and I don't know, that during the summer we had to do work, and in the winter, especially, let's say in Alberta and Saskatchewan, there was long nights and more time for us to sit around and tell stories. So thinking through this, but also treading carefully on how. But I mean, it has to be a self-reflective process, continually asking these hard questions and then getting advice from people who've done this a lot longer than I have.
Maybe a related question, because I was curious also about where the stories came from that you used in the talk, and thank you very much for your talk as well. One of the things I was wondering about was about language, and if you're using a kind of software to kind of parse these stories that are recorded. I don't know if are they. I was curious if they're in Cree or if they're in English, and if there's aspects in terms of doing this kind of analysis, applying it to kind of economics. That's bound up in the conceptual framework articulated through the Cree language versus coming through a kind of English version recorded. I was just curious if you could speak to that.
And actually, a few of the books that I've gone through have Cree on one side and English on the other. So, but a limitation for me is that I'm not fluent enough, well, one, in written standard Roman orthography in Cree, and also just in knowing it to be able to work with that. But it's neat that those accounts were taken, 100 years ago, and the people doing it even had the forethought to think of doing it in the Cree language. But it definitely is a limitation of the process. And another thing is, because I'm looking at principles and not necessarily like the idea of having principles come out, I think it could mitigate it a bit, because it's not necessarily the specifics, and hopefully after I do enough of them and become more fluent in Cree, I can work through that a bit more.
For one more.
I know I'm going to make a mess of this, but so Acimostakewin,
Storytelling.
is that what it is? Is that forming story?
Yeah.
How do you pronounce it properly?
Oh, okay. Well, Acimostakewin and Chimo is like tell me a story, and our story, and yeah. So this is storytelling.
Thank you very much. This is great. Just your talk reminded me to remember that Karl Marx, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto, used notes taken by Engels, who had spent time with the Iroquois. So the idea of even imagining a cooperative kind of economy came from the Iroquois, which is really important for us to remember. So I want to say thank you for reminding me. My question is around the acts of resistance. Your point around drawing on Cree economies as a form of resistance. And I wonder if you could speak to whether that, in this particular moment in time, means that resistance requires indigenous to indigenous forms of economy.
Yeah.
Whether the state is involved in any way, and what does it mean for settlers?
Yeah.
Right, in terms of, I'm thinking various kinds of cooperative groups. So maybe you're not there yet to say.
I think it definitely does. Like when you look at these international trading networks and trading practices, that's what it was, is indigenous people trading with indigenous people. And I had to cut some because it was too long, but there's another account where this guy named, it's Black Coat is the translation, goes to this person that's hunting buffalo but not seen as an indigenous person and says, my chief told me to come here because you need to pay a tariff for hunting buffalo on our Cree land. And I thought, wow, isn't that interesting that 130 years ago, that there's this notion that, okay, you're infringing on our boundaries and you need to do this. And then another thing that this makes me think of, so if international indigenous trading was historically, the archival and all of it points to that, why is the Canadian government trying to get into it now? And I think of, this is a controversial one, but even this cigarette trade and the cigarettes going to a community in Alberta and how the provincial government interceded and confiscated that and tried to get one of the chiefs to step down. And and then the Indian Act is just being on the table in the House of Commons to be changed. And one of the articles that's suggested to be changed is search and seizure of goods. And that's exactly what it is to do, is so the state can go in there and take these goods and to circumvent these indigenous trade networks. Yeah. And one of my committee members, Robert Nichols, he really pushed me in doing this, and I think it's really helpful, was to not look at just economic practices, but economic relationships. And I think that really fits within what you're saying and also fits within the indigenous way of thinking through these.
All right. Well, join me in thanking Shalene. The story she shared earlier, the bet that we actually had was that Shalene would be wearing a biker jacket and riding a Harley, smoking cigars. So it's the closest thing we have to a biker jacket.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you, Shalene, and for the excellent talk. And we'll see you all again in January 9th for Leanne Simpsons, but join me in thanking Shalene.